and I want to thank everyone who is joining today for an event which I see as a natural extension of our previous report and events on Yemen. The report on Yemen outlined the following situation. Massive funds are flowing into a dysfunctional country, of which large swaths are controlled by a criminal terrorist organization. The organization, known as the Houthis, is doing everything in its power to get its hands on this money because there are so few opportunities to generate revenue in Yemen. And then the aid organizations are doing an inadequate job of monitoring the success of these projects and failing to report the very real risks of diversion. I believe that after today's presentation and reviewing the report we have produced at CEP, you will find that the situation in Somalia very strongly echoes the situation in Yemen. The fact that war zones are filled with predators who are willing to steal from the poor is not what we can realistically aim to change, but it is something we should mitigate more seriously. The essential building block for any mitigation strategy is transparency, and without that, we cannot reliably trust that aid money is being sent to the starving instead of being siphoned off by militants. With that said, I will move on to provide a bit of background on the situation in Somalia as it pertains to aid before drilling down on the shortcomings of some of the world's largest aid organizations in providing a realistic and comprehensive picture reflective of their aid work in Somalia. Next slide, please. So now it's worth saying a few words about the scope of aid to Somalia. Somalia is a country with a GDP that only recently passed the $10 billion mark, meaning that the over $1 billion flowing into it each year is a significant amount. It might be estimated to account for around 10% of the country's economic activity. This means that, like all other major industries in Somalia, it is a target for those seeking to extract rents via threats and corruption. Somalia is not an easy place to do business in any industry. It is ranked dead last in a number of indexes related to corruption and ease of doing business. Therefore, one would imagine that exceptional oversight should be exercised over the more than $1 billion of aid money pumped into the country each year. Next slide, please. Now, what you can see here, based on the four largest programs of the Humanitarian Response Plan, is that the majority of the funding goes to providing 5 million Somalis with food and water, which are basic necessities. This makes sense given the dismal situation in Somalia, which has devastated the country's economy and caused mass displacement. Of course, these types of essentials, especially food or the money to buy it, are easier to repurpose than other goods or services that might be provided, such as education or healthcare. Next slide, please. So this next section is about aid delivery, or more specifically, aid diversion of aid delivery. And in particular, what I want to highlight is three actors that are that we've identified that are most involved in the diversion of aid delivery in Somalia. Next slide, please. So the gatekeepers. Who are the gatekeepers? According to journalist Colin Lynch, they are a network of Somali landowners, clan leaders, police, and other local authorities who have systematically enforced a coercive system of taxes on US-funded aid recipients displaced by drought and conflict, threatening to arrest, beat, or deny life-saving assistance to those who refuse to pay up. The gatekeepers essentially run thousands of what are known as informal settlements, allowing displaced Somalis to live on their land and providing some basic services. In exchange, they tax the aid given to these Somalis as payment. They are able to do this because they often function as the interface between aid organizations and the internally displaced persons living in informal settlements, and often have their own militias. The UN acknowledges that these gatekeepers are not bound by any standards and that they have no idea to what extent the gatekeepers are diverting resources. This is a link in the humanitarian supply chain that is essentially a black box. The UN is not aware of the extent of the problem, does not appear to have clear policies on this issue, and does not openly and publicly convey the issue in proportion to its impact. Continued delivery of aid in coordination with these gatekeepers may serve the short-term interests of all parties. Somali IDPs get a portion of their aid, gatekeepers get their cut, and aid organizations can claim great access and success. But one must ask whether continuing to fund this model, as UN INGOs are doing, is in the interest of Somalis, or whether it is simply further entrenching the country's dysfunction by subsidizing the IDP economy. It is hard to believe that such an arrangement could exist without humanitarian organizations funding it. Next slide, please. So Al-Shabaab is a well-known terrorist group and perhaps the best funded branch of Al-Qaeda, with an estimated revenue of above $100 million. Aid organizations have ceased working in areas under Al-Shabaab control due to fear for their own physical safety and concerns that they will be implicated in terror financing schemes if they are extorted by the group. Yet, Al-Shabaab has not simply given up hope on extracting rents from the humanitarian aid entering Somalia. They have simply devised more indirect and creative routes for doing so. Firstly, they kidnap aid workers and demand ransoms for their return. Second, they set up sporadic checkpoints on key traffic arteries in order to extort those delivering aid. And third, they extort major aid implementation partners. For example, in the case of Hormuz, which is a cellular service provider responsible for facilitating hundreds of millions of dollars in cash transfers for aid organizations, Hormuz is a company that essentially gets a cut of the money they deliver. A percentage of the aid that is meant to be delivered to the recipients is then extracted from or by Hormuz as a fee. Al-Shabaab extorts Hormuz by demanding taxes. And when the company does not accommodate Al-Shabaab's demands, then the terror group launches bombing campaigns targeting their infrastructure and employees to convince them that it is in their interest to do so. Next slide, please. So another major problem that is mostly hinted at in audits, but is more evident on the basis of informant testimony documented by a terrific report from Humanitarian Outcomes, is that of corruption within the aid organizations themselves. World Food Program in particular was cited as having major corruption problems with respect to its voucher program. First, there were allegations that the selection process to become an authorized retailer was corrupt. Second, there were allegations that the World Food Program staff owned some of the stores selected as authorized retailers. What this means in practice, in addition to the double dipping, is that none of the others selected as authorized retailers are really competitive, because World Food Program employees would often demand that these aid recipients only purchase things from the stores that they own. And finally, some authorized retailers operate as cartels in order to extort higher than agreed upon prices from aid recipients. There is very little documentation of this problem, perhaps because it is the fox in charge of the henhouse, which means that those meant to remedy the problem, these aid organizations, are essentially the same organizations that are, in a sense, creating the problem. So therefore, we don't really see this appearing frequently in audits or other reports from the aid organizations, and we're left to rely on the statements of informants. This certainly seems like an issue that is worthy of a thorough investigation. Next slide, please. So why don't we have visibility into aid operations in Somalia? What is the existing oversight over aid operations that leaves so much unclear about where aid dollars are going? This next section will focus on the reports produced by the aid organizations themselves and give a deep dive into basically what their shortcomings are. Next slide, please. So the failure to report. The first instance I'd like to call your attention to is the UN OCHA Somalia report from 2019 that notes a number of worrying problems. These problems include evaluation and monitoring failures, unclear guidelines or KPIs to the point where it didn't seem like employees knew what they were supposed to be doing. And you could argue that these problems are from 5 years ago, and why am I dredging them up now? But the problem is that UN OCHA Somalia has not released a single follow-up report after this. Why is an organization managing a budget of $80 million per year unable to conduct an audit or follow-up report over the course of 4 to 5 years? This is indeed extremely worrying and points to a general problem of major gaps in reporting. Next slide, please. So another example I want to call your attention to is the UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO. FAO Somalia also took about 3 years to publish an audit, which is in and of itself a problem as they continue to manage hundreds of millions of dollars without disclosing the organization's major failures at the time. They were eventually disclosed in the audit, if only very superficially. So the fact that it took 3 years to publish this report obviously is another very serious reporting gap. But another real problem with this document released in 2024 and started in 2021 is that most people only have access to the executive summary. The publics of many countries, especially Western countries, are bankrolling these organizations with their tax dollars. Why can't American citizens see the full report? And this raises serious questions as to what they are trying to hide. Certainly, the executive summary is quite damning if you read through it. It's only 4 pages, and this raises serious suspicions regarding what you might find in the report itself. As you can see here, only permanent representatives of governments accredited to FAO and institutional resource partners of the FAO can submit written requests to the Inspector General for access to the full report. What that means, in short, is that taxpayers and other outside experts trying to examine or identify or understand what FAO is doing in Somalia will have to do with the executive summary rather than a full in-depth report. Next slide, please. So another instance I want to draw your attention to, which really indicates that a lot of these audits make conclusions that essentially cover up the evidence they provide, is the case of UNICEF in Somalia, 2022 to 2023. So UNICEF Somalia's its main project was the disbursement of cash, $167 million of cash, and that constituted about half of the organization's total operating budget in Somalia. The audit from these years assesses that there was limited and poor partner capacity and ineffective key controls over cash transfers, which created an increased risk of inefficiencies, fraud, and misuse of UNICEF funds. This seems like a pretty serious problem for essentially the organization's major program. But for whatever reason, we see that the report concludes that the weaknesses or deficiencies identified in the audit were unlikely to have a materially negative impact on the performance of the audited entity, area, activity, or process. And so what you can see here is that there's some sort of disconnect between these, on the one hand, the problems they're identifying, which are severe, and then the conclusion of the report, which seem almost like they are foregone because the conclusion is basically saying nothing's wrong, whereas the evidence or the information included in the report indicates extremely severe problems with key programs. Next slide, please. Okay, next is the claim of no evidence. So when it comes to cash-based transfers, you'll see very often in a lot of the literature from humanitarian organizations that there's no evidence that cash-based transfers are more prone to diversion than traditional means of aid delivery. I think we can understand a few things from this. Number one, it's interesting that aid organizations believe the burden of evidence is on everybody else rather than themselves. They're asking for hundreds of millions and in some cases billions of dollars over the course of a number of years to deliver cash-based transfers to aid recipients. And rather than saying they must prove that this is in fact more effective, less prone to diversion than traditional means of aid delivery, they're basically going with the claim there's no evidence indicating that it's more prone to diversion, I'm sorry. And I would say that the fact that there is no evidence is not necessarily something that we should see in such a positive light. I think when you're trying to compare these two modalities of aid delivery, from what I've seen from the reports, both in Yemen and in Somalia, we can see that The problem is really that there's no evidence for really very much at all. The evaluation and monitoring mechanisms are dysfunctional, extremely dysfunctional in both countries. And so what we can see is that the fact that there's a claim of lack of evidence is something that is extremely problematic, but it is really a result. Sorry about that. Hold on one second.
Ari, you still there? Have we lost you?
Yes, sorry about that. Um,
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
I'm here. So yeah, basically what I was saying is that the fact that there's a lack of evidence regarding cash-based transfers is a result of the failure of these aid organizations to really conduct appropriate monitoring and evaluation for any of the aid, both traditional and some of the newer cash-based transfer models. What I would say is what's perhaps most worrying about all of this is that given the failure in evaluation monitoring, what we can see is that Somalia and Yemen are actually being publicized as success stories to promote cash-based transfers. And the idea is that aid organizations want to expand this practice into other arenas. In particular, what I've seen is with respect to Sudan. And so the fact that these organizations or these modalities have not been tested, there's very little evidence regarding their efficacy, and now there's claims to even expand them further, is something that is extremely worrying. Next slide, please. So another major issue identified among aid organization, which indicates a severe failure to act responsibly, is the scaling up of deeply flawed aid programs. In particular, with the World Food Program, we've seen over the years, in terms of their reporting, that there have been major flaws in terms of their evaluation and monitoring, their transparency. But in 2021, they were ranked some improvement needed. There were significant concerns regarding this audit for 2021, indicating that they didn't really have the appropriate controls and hadn't, let's say, mitigated the risks appropriately for the cash-based transfers. But nevertheless, they scaled up. And if I'm not mistaken, they increased their budget threefold over the 2 years that followed. And so what we have as a result of that is essentially like building a skyscraper on a foundation that couldn't even really support a house. You had a very problematic program, and instead of fixing the program before building on it or expanding it, what we did is there was a massive expansion, and the results are not surprising. Just two choice quotes from the 2023 audit are: the country office expanded mobile money as a cash-based transfer mechanism from 40% in 2021 to 60% of its aid budget without adequately assessing the associated fraud risks, especially relating to identity control. And then the country office has not verified the identity of its mobile money beneficiaries in the past 3 years. So what you can see here is essentially acting extremely irresponsibly, known flaws for these programs that have not stopped these organizations from demanding and using and pouring more money into these very flawed aid programs. Next slide, please. So the result of this lack of transparency demonstrated by these aid organizations are the fact that we have no clear picture regarding diversion rates. Till this date, for both Yemen and Somalia, we've looked through countless audits, reports, annual reports. Never have I seen an actual diversion rate that is being confirmed by any single organization. So we have no idea what those diversion rates are. The closest we've come to that was seeing a target diversion rate in Yemen that was 20%, and the only thing we saw was that it was not met. So meaning the diversion rate was above 20%. But we haven't seen any clear picture regarding diversion rates. There's been no accountability for failures. Of course, we're seeing the empowerment of bad actors, malicious criminal enterprises, terrorist groups. And to my mind, where the UN and INGOs are really failing is their implication of themselves in the cover-up for these problems. I think the fact that it's difficult to deliver aid in places like Yemen and Somalia is well understood. But the idea that you're trying to cover up the failures is something that I think really, in a lot of ways, wastes taxpayer funds, discredits international humanitarian aid organizations, and is something that really, it's in some ways, I guess you could say the cover-up is worse than the crime. Next slide, please. So now thinking ahead about the problems we identified and what can be done to address them. Well, we really came up with 5 recommendations for this report. These are in addition to the recommendations we provided in the Yemen report, some of which from the Yemen report are also applicable to Somalia. But of course, as I gave you the examples from OCHA and from FAO, there needs to be more accurate and frequent audits. Auditing an organization once every 4 years, once every 5 years is not adequate when we're dealing with budgets of hundreds of millions of dollars and problems that are going unaddressed in the meantime. Number 2, there should be public access to all audits, at the very least in countries where taxpayers have funded these organizations. The idea that they can keep secret audits regarding how taxpayer funds are being spent is, to my mind, unacceptable and really raises more questions than it answers. I think it raises a lot of suspicions regarding what is in these reports and how bad the situation actually is. We should have impartial investigations into major programs modalities like CBTs before large-scale adoption. We see a lot of claims from humanitarian organizations and from some academics involved in the aid world regarding CBTs, but I would say that the idea that there's no evidence that's more prone to diversion is not adequate, and there should be a close investigation into what the diversion rate is for both CBTs and for traditional forms of aid before determining which is most appropriate and which is most cost effective. Fourth, the implementation of policies to rout out insider threats colluding to rip off aid projects. So as I mentioned, there's a severe problem of corruption within these aid organizations, and it is extremely important both for the reputation of the aid organizations themselves and to ensure that aid is reaching the people that it should be reaching, and it's done in a cost-effective manner to deal with these insider threats, as I call them, more effectively. And then finally, making policy about well-known issues more transparent in order to allow for public debate and informed donor choices, in particular when it comes to the issue of gatekeepers. So gatekeepers are a well-known issue. It's a very prevalent issue in Somalia, but yet there is no clear policy from any of these aid organizations how to interact with them, if to interact with them, and under what conditions. And I think this is something that both makes things less transparent to donors, and I imagine also very much complicates the life of aid workers in the field who are basically given no instruction about how to proceed regarding gatekeepers. And so with that, I want to thank you, and we'll now welcome any questions.